Hi, everybody. My name is Bar Taylor, and I have the privilege of introducing Megan Bell to you all briefly. And thank you all for coming. What a fantastic turnout. And I want to thank Eduardo, who gave up his laboratory space for doing this. Julia and the Betts team, who are astounding in terms of getting this all together, which is really great. And then Dr. O'Connor, who is always an inspiration and has been so supportive of this, of trying to enhance all of our understanding of how we network, what the potential of the field of psychology is and opportunities and so forth. So I'll be very brief. I've had the privilege of working with Megan for quite a long, I've got a little choked up, for quite a long time. She's an amazing person who got her Psy.D through this Stanford PGSP consortium. And I was, her dissertation chair. Megan's work on her dissertation was breathtakingly wonderful. I sometimes feel a little guilty because I expect too much of the students, but I have to say that Megan, whatever expectations I had, Megan was here, and then she would go way beyond that. So, and I just got back from a meeting in Valencia. I'm a little fuzzy because I'm severely jet lagged, and as part of that meeting a number of years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, Megan had been very influential in creating and helping to create a consortium of internet-based digital studies all throughout Europe, looking at various kinds of programs that would be delivered in the schools, through healthcare settings, and through health employers and so forth, and also really help design and run these particular studies. So the eye care program has been very successful, and I think in part because Megan helped get everything off to a right start. And she also worked with a company named Lantern, a very exciting company that had a digital program to provide various interventions. Unfortunately, Lantern has since gone out of business. It was a company that was probably a little bit too ahead of its time. I should just mention to all of you that Michelle, who works with us, has reported an article in which there are 1,000 startups in digital technology and mental health, 1,000 startups. So I think the opportunities are going to be really strong for everybody. But then Megan went to Headspace, where she's now the chief scientific officer, and has done really amazing work in working with a company that is incredibly successful. I don't know how much, you can feel free to ask about Headspace, but next month, how many customers you have? They have 65 million customers. That would even make Ricardo happy, right? So, all right, so with no further ado, Megan, thanks so much for taking the time, and we're so honored to have you here.
So much, Barb. Thank you for inspiration for this wonderful event, and thank you, Estelle, for joining us tonight. So we're going to have some conversation, and then I'll ask a few questions, but we'll certainly save time in the end for people to also ask questions, both in the room and on Zoom. So this is being zoomed out to dozens of people, I don't know where, but wherever they are, they're going to do it as much as us. So let's start out. You heard a little bit about your career trajectory, but to the PGSP Stanford Psy.D consortium, which we're very proud of, which of course just received 10 years of accreditation from the American Psychological Association. It's a fantastic program. You went from that program to through various iterations that got you to Headspace. So tell us a little bit about that trajectory. How did you see that? Is that where you thought you were going?
Not at all. So it wasn't really a career path I thought was an option for me. You know, my goal in actually going into psychology in the first place was to make mental health care more affordable, accessible, but really specifically, actually I started when I was an undergraduate student, I was running a prevention program for eating disorders as part of my undergraduate thesis in schools, training volunteers, and it didn't feel very scalable. Train a volunteer, then they leave and go on to do other things. And so I read one of Barr's papers, and then just became obsessed with the idea of working with him. So the only way I could do that was to go to the Psy.D program. My dad thought I had totally left the reservation and going to a non-accredited program at the time, but was determined to really understand how to use technology to provide access at scale, and really ideally change culture so that people were more inspired to address their mental health before it became a problem for them. My passion has really always been prevention of mental health problems. So in Barr's lab, we developed, dozens of different evidence-based interventions. And I thought I had the job that I wanted to keep for the rest of my life, and somehow clawing my way into the faculty of psychiatry, and was really happy there. I had the well-rounded balance of teaching, seeing patients, doing research. I was one of the coordinating practicum, did a brief stint, and so. But I was increasingly frustrated that we had, federal funding to get these grants, do the research, build the programs, and then the study would be over and no one could access it. And so we worked, Barr and I, pretty hard with an advisor who knew a little bit more about commercializing things to find a path forward. That's how Lantern got started. I had no intention of being part of it at the beginning. But really, in order for that company to get funding, I needed to join the team full time. So what started out as a brief leave of absence, once it became permanent over time. And for me, it really felt like a sense of freedom. But I remember making that decision to actually quit Stanford. And at the time thought, I don't know what other job I'm going to get if Lantern doesn't work out. Because there, were some like mom and pop shop, other mental health companies out there, but not really an industry to go into at the time. But took the leap of faith, and but certainly did not have a roadmap. I just followed I just felt like I've always managed to land on my feet. I kind of pitched my postdoc, was in the position I applied to, so I kind of had that entrepreneurial spirit of taking a slightly unconventional path, but really being mission driven and knowing what I want to accomplish. So that's what continues to be my compass rather than someone else's path, frankly.
I think that's when you're in the best shape, is when it's your path and not what somebody else thinks your path should be.
Yeah, I think you have to tolerate some uncertainty and ambiguity in that process, which is uncomfortable, but is a sense of freedom in that as well.
Absolutely. So you landed at Headspace after all that, and I love the fact that your title, first of all, is Chief Science Officer. So I think anytime a psychologist's title is Chief Science Officer, it's a good thing. So that's very exciting. But I noticed also that you oversee both Headspace for work and Headspace for health, and so that's, so tell us a little bit about your work there.
So my role at Headspace, and just like give context about the company, are like two of our core values are authenticity and science. So one, we started with fairly authentic founder, spent 10 years training as a Buddhist monk, fulfilled with his monastic commitment, and then decided to really devote himself to teaching mindfulness and trying to make that practice more accessible, and demystify what is, an ancient tradition. So that's actually where the company grew out of, and I'd actually been collaborating on studies before I joined. I inherited about 33 studies that were active already, with collaborators around the world. Now we have about 70 plus studies that are going on. So part of my job, and what I was really hired to do, was work with our external collaborators, it's all independent research, investigator initiated, meaning people are contacting Headspace wanting to use the product in their studies, we make it free for them to do that, provide them the data that we collect, which is really just around usage, and empower the academic community to evaluate this. Of course, that's helpful to us because we want to make sure that anything we make, and anything we say about the use of Headspace is backed in science. So what our team, our science team, has developed is a process of working with experts to inform how we make things and what we make, and then take that extra step to validate that in fact it does work. So we've now actually taken the step of funding research as well. We feel like it's strategic, and have a team of have behavioral scientists, other Psy.D graduates who are on the team, have a health economist, have neuroscientists, so different disciplines who can also advise researchers on how to design trials that are actually moving the needle rather than replicating what I would consider more pilot stage research, which was frankly my read on the literature of mindfulness when I joined Headspace. Was this field did not progress to more sophisticated trials. So it's been really fun to work on what are now some of the largest studies of mindfulness that have ever been done, including many studies that look at novice meditators and the effect, including more objective measures of outcome.
I was reading one of your recent studies that tested a self-guided mindfulness app, and compared it to, I think it was a narrative, like a book, guidance. So it was sort of a very nice control. And I was going to quote the results section. It said, after completing a brief 10-day introductory program of the mindfulness app, we reduced average levels of self-reported stress and irritability and increased average mood ratings. That was a 10-day program. So first of all, I'm so proud of the fact that this is what you do. The evidence-based training that you received and bringing that into this practice, and that you found a company where this is valued. But I wondered about, how have you been so successful, or how is, really Headspace with you at the helm of this, at kind of being convincing that it's important enough to do this work. I think, I mean, we see what did you say, 1,000 companies, and I suspect most of them are not doing clinical trials of any with control groups and things like that. So how do you think the importance of these expensive clinical trials and science-driven approach, like how do you think that took hold?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, frankly, Headspace invested in this for a long time just because of the values of the founders, and the belief that if we want to be, they're not in it for financial gain. Right? They're founding this because this is coming out of their personal experience of being, having their lives transformed by mindfulness and wanting to make it accessible at scale. It actually started as a nonprofit doing live meditation training, and the app was developed to help people bridge those in-person trainings. So that's really in the DNA. So I think we had permission to do research, to invest in science before there was necessarily a business case for doing that. However, one of the things that I think we have really shown is there is a business case for developing an evidence-based product. And as the market becomes more educated, not necessarily the consumer market, because that's going to be slower to change, but when an employer decides to make mental health, a digital mental health app or service available to their employees as a covered benefit, or an insurance company decides to cover it for their members, or a doctor prescribes it to a patient, they expect a different level of evidence. And so that is really where the business case for an evidence-based intervention comes in, and what's really justified us, our ability to put millions of dollars into our research and the investigators with whom we work. And I think that's also what creates, now that I'm, the majority of my role now is actually running two of our businesses. I hired one of our other alums to take over the science role.
Keep going.
So yeah, we just posted another job. But so I'm running our enterprise businesses, which mean our Headspace for Work business and Headspace Health, which is our digital therapeutics subsidiary company. So what those businesses do is actually make a version of Headspace that's slightly more comprehensive and has some additional services around it. We sell to companies as a mental health benefit. We work with health systems to integrate into their digital formularies where, in some cases it might be a therapist or psychiatrist or a primary care doctor is able to prescribe apps. There are some health systems that have rolled this out, as well as insurance companies. But when we sell to them, they're looking at Headspace compared to, other solutions. And that's where the evidence has really started to make a difference. And where we see some of our Headspace's competitors who had completely ignored science previously are starting to catch up, which is a great thing because it means that we've created a standard that then is going to lift all ships. But I think it's really up to the industry to use science as a competitive edge, because unfortunately the ethical argument didn't seem to be enough. So yeah, but it's been interesting, and frankly in the digital therapeutics world, which is half of where I live via Space Health, we do have an industry, a trade organization, the Digital Therapeutics Alliance, where in order to be part of that, you do have to agree to standards, and evidence is one of them, and actually the way you conduct clinical trials is part of that. But it goes along with data privacy and security. If you're going to collect data about your end users, you need to do so in a secure way, which can be influenced by regulatory frameworks. It can also be something that you adopt because it's the right thing to do. But as an industry, we are trying to self-organize to standardize some of these things.
I think it's so important to hear this because I think there was a worry, and probably still a little bit of a worry, but certainly there was a worry that be the least common denominator that would succeed, right? As opposed to the high-end denominator, right? Yeah. So I think that's actually very, very encouraging. And something I wondered about in our first event of this type, we asked this question too. And I think it's really important for our students, especially and alums. How many alums? We have some alums in the room. But I think something that's interesting is the work you're doing now. As you said, you might not have seen that as where you were heading. So how have you seen the role of psychologists and psychology evolve, sort of as the high-tech sector has evolved, especially here in Silicon Valley? Could you kind of walk through that with your own?
Yeah, I think there are so many different career paths that are open now as a psychologist in a technology company. And I think especially for psychologists, I really encourage people to think about the leadership roles that are available. You can certainly get great experience and exposure by working as a coach at one of these software and services businesses. You can get great experience working on a design research team where your skills are completely relevant. But I really think of your true value prop to technology as being in a decision-making seat within a company, being closer to the business decisions. That's actually why I've somehow landed in a business function, as well as my science hat. But it is if you are at least in the room where the decisions are being made, you have a vote in them, you can make sure that the business model of the company is aligned with doing the right thing for the end user, and what that right thing is better than someone who is trained in business development, for example. You're just going to understand the consequences of inviting people into your, I think about it as you've invited someone into your house, and if you're not able to help them, what is your responsibility in terms of guiding them to the thing that might help them? And I think someone who's taken, who has an ethical code, who understands what it means to be responsible for helping someone and guiding them to that next thing, you're going to make a different business decision or product decision, because you're going to have a more holistic view of it's not just a user, it's a person in the context. So I sincerely hope and have argued for years in any stage I'm allowed on, that someone with clinical expertise, if the company is providing clinical service, someone with clinical expertise needs to be in the room where decisions are made.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so good to hear, because I think there's, I'm in higher ed meetings all the time, and there are companies now who think they know how higher ed should operate, and they can run a coding academy, and that's all they tell you. You don't really need the degree, but I just about go crazy when I hear that. But I think you're really reinforcing. I mean, you received, as I know our students here received, excellent training and preparation in general clinical psychology. You weren't specializing in technology. You were getting, but the science and practice of psychology is what is at the foundation of it. And I think you've just answered this, but how important, I think another thing that students probably wonder, or people wonder generally, you did a lot of things in that training. You did a lot of hours of practicum, you had your internship, all those things. How do you draw on that? Now that you're at the table, right? How do you draw on all of that?
Well, I think, enormously, and if I look back, those were some of the busiest years of my life. And I have a 2-year-old, so but I wouldn't change anything, because that I do feel extremely well equipped. Whether it is if I'm meeting with the chief medical officer at a large company, or at a health system, and they want to go deep into the weeds on what the standard of care is for, pick a mental health condition out of a hat. Or, I am fluent and comfortable going toe to toe, and really helping guide them if they're new to implementing digital health on where is this actually appropriate, in a, care program or a system. Especially when you think about all the contexts in which a product is implemented, having had experience across multiple systems, working part of different integrative teams, understanding the whole spectrum of psychopathology. So going from working in a college counseling center to being at a job corps to being on the inpatient unit, I would never give that back, because it, I think, gives you a fluency and a confidence at understanding what I'm working on, where is this actually appropriate and where is it not going to be appropriate, where we're going to need to augment this or contextualize it differently. And I think helps you understand where your expertise starts and stops, because nothing we make is made only by the people who are on our team. It's through working with experts both. If we're embarking on something for anxiety, we're going to work with experts in anxiety, both in terms of people we have right here, but also people who are experiencing anxiety. I think that's the other side of it. Is it's not just those of us who have studied it and worked with people, but it's also involving the people who are struggling with this day-to-day, the lived experience, and having them have a seat at the table. So having a patient advisory board where they're actually looking at what you're making, helping you make it better and more relevant.
That's so interesting. Did that start from the beginning?
That's really been a design process that we're extremely committed to, is trying to really first understand what people need, what they want, what they are, what's not working for them about what might be out there already, and starting there with, if you're going through the human-centered design process would be desirability, and then going to evidence, and then going to the business case for it. But
I feel so often it starts the business and goes the other way, and I think that's probably why you've been so successful.
I mean, if you make something that people actually need and want, it's a different story.
So given all of that, I guess, what advice might you have for current students, whether they're in counseling or psychology, or, sort of what would you suggest for their thinking about this?
Well, I think, if your ambitions are to go into technology, you're going to be in an environment where there are experts in technology. Let them be the experts there, right? You have the opportunity. You are going to be the potentially only person in rooms where you actually have the clinical experience or you have the research experience. And so I do think that particularly for you to be a thought leader, feel confident making those decisions, don't compromise on the quality of training that you actually get to have here, because that's what's really going to set you apart. I think it's great to have a breadth of exposure and how you can apply those skills. But if I think about, what I look for in anybody that I hire is, are you strategic? Can you help develop a strategy? Are you able to manage operations? What we do has to be done at enormous scale. So but if you've actually implemented something, or you have worked in a clinic where you have some experience of, you have a population to serve, you have a certain number of people who can actually provide that intervention. How do you solve that math problem efficiently and without compromising quality? There are a lot of the experiences that people have in a clinical setting that are very translatable to the kind of business or technology world. But I would really say, you let people who are the experts be the experts, and really kind of
don't try to sell yourself as being the tech person if you're really the clinical person.
Yeah, I mean, I have a CTO. I have 70 engineers to do their job. And so I think that's really where I would aim high when you go in, rather than, take the entry-level job because you might need to get that experience, but really be aiming at a leadership role, especially if you've just invested, half of a decade.
Well, you just mentioned the leadership. I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So, when you were talking about how psychology, how your career really and your education prepared you to really be in a leadership role, there's a group of us, university presidents who are psychologists, and we all talk about how it's such good training for this type of position. There's something about our training, I think, that gives us some perspective on leadership. But I noticed in your bio that you're pretty involved in some outside groups, some particularly around women's leadership, near and dear to my heart. So I saw that you were mentoring young women, and you've done been on a number of boards, I think, around these issues. So I don't know if you'd be willing to talk kind of about that work a little bit. Why is it so important to you, and sort of how do you see it fitting in?
Yeah. So I went to an all-girls school in Palo Alto for 6 through 12, which was a very impactful experience for me of being a very shy, I can't do it kid to suddenly I was the editor, on the stage giving a talk. So I've seen how when, particularly for young girls, they're in an environment that gives them an alternative and gives them the support they need to be more empowered, that's transformative of a trajectory. So for me, it's been important to contribute to that. So I have been involved in a number of organizations that are trying to support particularly younger women's empowerment, but also mentor. I'm a member of a couple of different women's leadership organizations. International Women's Forum is one of them. They partner with Ernst & Young to mentor former Olympic athletes who are trying to change careers. So I have been assigned athletes or
Wow.
who choose to work with me if they want to, if they're interested in my area. So have more one-on-one and deeper mentoring in that area. And then I've been involved in a healthcare leadership group through the Aspen Institute to try to introduce more values-based leadership into healthcare. But it's something that I think as a psychologist, I've just observed as I am more in this kind of general leadership position within a company, responsible for, hundreds of people. You have very unique skills to bring, really as a coach to your peers, in terms of interpersonal, effective interpersonal communication, really being able to mentor people. And as you are a leader within an organization, that's a big part of what your job is. And so, I'm often asked, do you miss anything about your life when you got to teach and train students and supervise? I'm like, that's still what I do. I just do it within a different environment.
That's good. I love that. I mean, I think it's hard. I love that you've taken the time to find a way to do that, because I'm sure that it would be easy to say you don't have time to do it right. I mean, I struggle with that all the time. Like, you don't have time to do this organization over here that needs you, because you're so busy. But I think what you're talking about is that time benefits. It brings back benefits to so many things. It's worth making the time.
It is, and I think it's, for me, at this point, I don't want to collect a lot of extracurriculars. It's not about, I'm not trying to build my CV. If there is I have a set of, there are a handful of things that I really, really care about, and want to do them with quality and intention, and there's always space for that. And I'm also in an environment that is extremely supportive of doing that. So I don't do anything that's, the fact that I'm involved in these other endeavors, the fact that my people on my team are still teaching at Stanford or running a women's organization, that's part of, that's who we want at our company, are people who are socially engaged in that way. So I think it is, if that is something that is valued by your organization, you also have permission to do that. So that's another thing to look for, is, are there people who are there actively involved in their communities or industries in other ways? And if so, then it's probably going to be a place that nurtures growth.
Well, and then in the leadership role, you can also then model that, which is, I think,
yeah. Everyone on our leadership mentors actively. So our CEO mentors probably a dozen other CEOs, and he's mentored by, the ones you recognize the names. So but that's we've all benefited from that. It's a kind of pivot forward.
So one of the things our students often ask about, and we have a question in this area I wanted to ask you about it, because I know, I can tell this is part of your pitch, but as we're learning clinical skill sets, how do we promote mental health equity? I mean, obviously, this is one of the things that's been motivating to you, but do you have any advice, really, for all of us, like how can we best train our students to think about mental health equity and access to care?
I think first we need to go experience firsthand what it's like to not have it. So work in communities that are underserved populations that are not able to access care. I think, when you see and experience the realities that the majority of the population have, it anchors you and it reminds you that it must be addressed. And I have so much respect for these businesses that are actually making that their exclusive focus, like the City Block Health in New York was like, you could make more money or have an easier path by focusing on a population that has the ability to pay, or you could go, zoom in on the group that doesn't and figure out how to make that a viable business. I think that's incredibly inspiring. And so I think that's why I hope so much that psychologists are in business making decisions, because you can really, if you can learn the business skills, and if you can put that together, you can apply it in areas where people have said it's not going to work. And if you apply a fact-based approach to that, there are things that do work and are extremely scalable. You just need a bit of a light shine on them. So, and then in wherever you work, you can develop what I would consider more design processes that actively pull in the input of the groups that you think don't use your product or can't use your product. So that's something that my team is extremely committed to in going out when we do research to inform what we're going to make. We go into communities and actively solicit that feedback, go into people's homes, talk to their caregivers, go into schools where we've made it free, and really get that firsthand input to understand how we can design something that is more inclusive.
That's so many of our students talk about. That's one of the reasons they come, right? They want to make a difference in communities that don't have access to care, and then when you get out into the world, it's hard to see that path. So it's really important. So I'm gonna ask one more question, and then I'm gonna open up for people to ask, because I'm sure there are lots of questions there. But we labeled this series Superstar Psychologists and Technology. We have a cake for you later. But obviously we're trying to find psychologists who are doing really, really amazing work in various aspects of the technology world. But I think I'd love some advice back to us at PAU. We're in the business of training students and doing research on these matters as well. So how can PAU, what would be your advice to us for supporting kind of the optimal research and clinical experiences to ensure we continue to produce people in your path?
Well, I would say, part of what sets so many of the alum that have come out of these programs and are in leadership positions is they just have excellent clinical and research training. So when you are a expert in your field, you have that very strong foundation in evidence-based practice. I think you can apply that in a lot of different ways.
They're not just making that up, but they have to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where you wouldn't be compromising. If I'm hiring someone with a unique technical ability, that's why I'm hiring them. I can teach them how to apply it to technology. So I think getting exposure, working on different interventions, trying to make something yourself is great, so that you're better able to understand some of what I would call the cross-functional, skills. You don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel or, create something from scratch. So your other option is to try to collaborate with companies and use their products and research. You get more exposure to working with that company. We've hired people that way. I know other digital health companies have hired students who are using their products and research. So that's one pipeline, is actually doing a research project on an existing commercially available product and trying to apply it to a different population. But I personally found it extremely valuable to try to make things we just didn't have enough funding to hire an engineer. I think that roll up your sleeve mentality is really part of tech and particularly a startup. So learning how to do something that you think you can't do is also probably just a good experience of being uncomfortable. But I think would expose you to the disciplines with whom you'd be working.
I think we should have a class with this research project.
Yeah, I mean, I took some computer science classes on the side so I could build one, like some really horrible version of program on, some platform that was, yeah, like how do I add an HTML plugin to WordPress? And, it's like painful, locked in some, cabinet at Stanford somewhere trying to figure this out. But I have a better appreciation of what I'm asking them to do.
But you can't do, right?
Like, why I so value working with people who are experts and what they bring. But I think it's fun. It also kind of it does help you understand, some of the ways that you actually build technology. It makes you a little, but frankly, one of the things that I've done at every company I've worked in is create like a custom onboarding for people who are coming out of either a clinical path or academic path. They don't know the terminology in tech. There's like all of this jargon flying around where people are sitting in meetings, like, which is what I was, but just acting like I knew what they were talking about until I figured it out. So I think that's where, finding interning in like a design research group where you can bring enormous value, but it's really a repackaging of your skills.
We just had a trustee who wants to support some kind of innovation project, and I'm thinking maybe turn it into a class, class project kind of thing. So I hadn't thought about the fact that people should actually put their hands in dirty.
Well, and in the experience of doing, what you might consider field research. So one of the things I did while I was at Stanford was leverage that IDEO relationship and did work, some trainings there so I could learn this human-centered design process, which I then hired their head of healthcare to lead our Headspace Health team because it's so valuable. But it's something that's going to be familiar to a psychologist, but it's a slightly different methodology. It's packaged differently, but it's hugely relevant in building any product, frankly.
Well, I could just keep going, but I think I'd like to stop myself so that I can let some of you ask questions. Yes.
I just want to follow up on what you just said about having a class to do that. We actually do have a class.
Okay.
It's called,
what do I know? I know you have a class in technology,
it's called Evidence-Based Internet Intervention to Reduce Health Disparities.
Yes.
And it's offered in the winter. And the homework is, there are three major pieces of homework. The first two are a prototype dissertation. So the first homework is writing the introduction to a dissertation, 10 pages. It's a prototype and not a full dissertation. The second one is the method section, how you would test it.
Yeah.
And the third one is an evidence-based intervention. You have to create a website that's an intervention website, and it's using a work that Jan Laken and Dr. Blanca Pineda, who is here, have been developing in the last year. Dr. Laken has developed two interventions, one a very small one, kind of a micro intervention, and the other one a much longer one that has several modules and so on. And he's using Qualtrics, which we have as, every student has access to Qualtrics.
Right.
So he has developed a template that allows you to create an intervention. And that's the third assignment for this class. It's taught in the winter, and it's an elective. And I teach the class, and Dr. Pineda teaches the Qualtrics part, which helps people to actually create an actual intervention. So.
That's great.
I love it.
Yeah, well, it actually reminds me, we did have interns when Lantern existed. One of the projects I had them do was take a CBT technique that was from the Lantern program where we felt like people were dropping off, where there was, like cognitive restructuring, like anything in a component of an intervention that is just harder to do digitally without explanation or support in applying that skill, and actually looking at doing a competitive analysis, which is just a but you're going to do that if you're in a product role, a business role, but looking at all of the different ways that other interventions do that, and then working on a design project to try to improve that specific. But I think it doesn't always need to be, as you said, micro-intervention, Ricardo, which reminded me of this. It's like, it's not necessarily the entire thing. It's like, what are these components that we need to figure out a better way of delivering, where creativity and is needed.
All right. Other, thank you. Yes, we have some Zoom.
So we have a question from the
All
Zoom
right,
audience.
awesome.
One person's asking, what does a typical day at work look like for you? And are there any pros and cons of working on a team with professionals from other career paths, like engineers, for example?
Yeah, so I might scare everyone right now. Not with the engineer question, but yeah, I'm just in meetings all day long. It's not that glamorous. So yeah, I mean, a typical day. I mean, it can be interesting. I mean, a typical day is, you know, I have a touch point with my management team, so that's our CEO, the rest of the C-level team, to address like blockers or, you know, there's like real-time decisions that need to be made. I have my leads team, which are like the VPs essentially that are reporting to me. It might be going and meeting with a customer. It might be, you know, talking to one of our research collaborators. It's like all over the place. There's probably like 30 different problems that I have to solve in the course of between those meetings somehow. Yeah, I mean, for me, it is teamwork all day long. But it spans everything from, you know, talking to the, you know, head of the American Medical Association about our partnership and what we're planning for their next event, to introduce Headspace to healthcare professionals. It might be trying to plan a launch. It's quite varied, and I just love working with different functions. So I think one of the really cool things about being on an interdisciplinary team, period, what we call cross-functional team in tech, is that people think about things differently. When, you know, we're solving problems all day long, the way that I look at that problem and our CTO looks at that problem versus our chief creative officer, we're coming at it from really different views, and that's what is so stimulating to me personally.
That's even true in my, I mean, I love working across the domains of even just the university. You know? So, I mean, I think if you can, you know, the more siloed we are in our lives, so the less interest is, right? Just you want to be able to be out and about talking to others that you don't always understand.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm often jealous of what my team gets to work on because I'm so far from at this point, but they're showing me all the cool stuff they're doing, and like, yeah, I approve it. That's why that's kind of where I've landed now. Yeah, but it's like, you know, fine tuning the great ideas that they've already gotten 90% of the way there, so and getting out of their way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You talked about it already, but can you talk about the entry-level positions that psychologists find themselves in, how typically best to?
Yeah, so I have an entry-level psychologist position that's open as of last week, but this is the entry-level position that I would look at it as an example. I would not hire a psychologist into anything below that level. So it's already a level that frankly is like 3 or 4 levels in terms of all of the types of roles we have in a company like Headspace. I think that's important for you to know. There's another role that's open right now, which is a research manager role. For that, we're looking at someone who has, you know, finished college, worked in a lab, managed, you know, multi-site studies, or has a master's degree. But we're not looking for a psychologist. That would be you can look at those to understand what we call, you know, there's leveling. So within a company we peg roles to certain compensation ranges, experience ranges. But the level that I've just posted is a good example of a entry-level psychologist job. It's someone who is fresh out of postdoc, what we're looking to hire. And what we're looking for is someone who has strong training in evidence-based practice, has done research, is able to independently do research. So you don't necessarily need to, you're not going to, for us, for Headspace, you're not going to be writing a grant, but you are going to be designing a study. And designing studies
You're
is
published in
really,
peer-reviewed journals.
we are, but we don't need external funding. So I think in some companies you would, but we have the benefit of already being a viable business. So, but that job specifically is intended to work with a cross-functional team, design a new intervention that we want to make. And that will involve doing lots of applied internal research. That's part of our product development process, where we go do that human-centered design process that I mentioned. And then as we build prototypes every 2 weeks in a sprint, go back and test it with groups of users. Because for us, it's like, it's an every 2 week, we take a step, we go test it. We take a step, we go test it. And so that's a process that I want psychologists to be part of, so that they can add that unique view. So I think that's probably a good example. There are other positions that I've seen that are much more research-based, where they want you to be able to write a grant, like an SBIR or SDTR kind of grant, apply for funding. So there's a range of, this is more of a behavioral science job. There are other jobs that are good entry-level research jobs. Yeah.
For future graduates, would you feel that it's realistic to be splitting time, for example, like seeing patients 50% of the time, working at a company like this, and a 50%, or do you think you really need to commit to
I think you can, some companies don't quite know what they need. If there's not someone like me already in the company, that might be a good place to start. And the advice I tend to give people is, like if someone, it's kind of like if you're asking someone to mentor you, like go ask them what they need help with, how you can help them. Don't ask, not the other way around. And you'll get mentoring in that process of helping them with something. And I think this is part of it too, is a lot of these companies know they need somebody clinical, but they don't quite understand how to make value of that person. So it might be that that's a good foot in the door. But I would hope that once you're there and you're proving the value that you have across the organization, you get pulled in. That said, it is a norm for many physicians who are in digital health to have 1 day a week where they still have a clinic. That's even true for many of the CEOs. I have a friend who's CEO of a major health system. He still sees patients 1 half day a week, but this is an important anchor in the realities, especially if what you're working on is more clinically relevant. So there's a good predicate of the medical directors, CMOs, CSOs doing this. I think for me, in the CSO world, I get to be, I'm still getting to design studies. I'm still very much, the fun parts of my day are talking to our collaborators or setting up a new project. So I still get to do that in the course of my job.
And I think one of the things I'm wondering with your question is, at what point in your career would you be ready to do that, right? How much have you already, grounded yourself in the training, right? In the clinical work?
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of people on postdocs start to consult with companies, and then use that as a way to, maybe while they're building up their practice, a private practice, they also are consulting with the company, and then can decide which path they want to take, or maybe that's what they continue to do. There's several faculty members I know who are primarily, in the, in a clinical role and like the stimulation of advising a company, but it's something that takes up, 5 to 10 hours of their time. It depends on what your interests I think what I would suggest is if you like that 50% in the company, it could very well be a full-time role. And so if you think it should be, you can make it that way by really proving value.
Yeah. So your team, so Headspace creates a massive amount of incredible content. I'm curious how your team plays a role in developing like the videos or the scripts or the narratives that actually end up in the app and what that process is like.
So my team vets any experts with whom we work. So anyone else whose ideas, voice, face, words, etc., shows up in the app has to go through our science team and one of our founders. So our former founder and I are responsible for vetting, and we have a process. It's very clearly operationalized on how we vet who's credible to do what. And for us, actually, anything that goes into the app has already gone through our legal team, our standards team, the brand team. There's a lot of steps that have to be taken before something is actually released worldwide. But science is a stakeholder and required sign off on everything that we do. And there's a lot of the content that we make is extremely low risk, so that's an easy process. It's not going to do harm, but we do want to make sure that if we are teaching someone how to do something, guiding them in a technique, that it is done appropriately. And if it's a place where it should be based on evidence, we need someone to work with us to make sure that
It sort of makes it seem like that isn't true, right? It just sort of seems so natural on the site.
Yeah. We have a great creative team, and I'm not responsible. I would not be allowed to write scripts, but I could make sure that they're accurate. Or, we did a big campaign for a mental health month, I think a few years ago, where we were doing a series of an audio series and content series that was about different types of mental illness, and we worked with Bring Change to Mind to have their patient advocates with lived experience review everything to make sure that we got it right. We were using a voice that spoke in a relatable way. So it's, in my mind, I might not be the expert, but I need to find the person that is, and that may well be someone from the community that we're trying to address.
Yeah, so we have a few questions from the audience.
From Zoom, and then we'll come back.
Okay, and one question is, are tech companies in the mental health space looking only for PhD candidates, especially for research jobs, for non-technical roles, or would an LMFT or a LPCC be a viable candidate in this space?
Absolutely. So I'll give you another example. We're hiring a coach manager role at Headspace, which is something that will be part of our Headspace Health Service. And that is a role where 100% yes. But absolutely, frankly, do you have experience working with evidence-based treatments? So that is a prerequisite. And then, a lot of other mental health disciplines have great operational experience. So there's a role that I'm hiring in the future in Space Health, where I actually think a nurse is probably the most appropriate person, given the kinds of operational clinical experience, but really clinical operations experience that a nurse kind of uniquely has. So I think it's really how you present yourself and how you, whether it's from your degree or other experiences, made yourself more of a well-rounded candidate. But
What do you see as the future of digital mental health and the role of psychology? Very simple question.
Yeah. Well, I think
Somebody recording.
Yeah, I think we're booming now. I think it's like it's a thing, and frankly, with the conversations that I get to have with these decision makers at some of the biggest companies in the world, 7 years ago we had to laboriously try to convince them about why mental health was important. Now they say, skip that part of your pitch. I don't need to know that there's an ROI. You don't need to tell me about how stark this problem is. like we care about it, we want to address it, we just want to find the right solution for it. And so, of course, that's not true of every company or every organization, but the conversation has changed. And what they're looking for are things that work, that people will actually use. And so I do think that the future of mental health is going to be much more mainstream. But it is really finding a way to meet people where they are, contextualize what we're making in people's lives in a way that can actually help create healthy routines. I think we have a legacy of kind of directly adapting what we do in an in-person context for a digital modality. And I think we really need to think more flexibly about how we tailor interventions, how we support people in actually using the elements of interventions that are actually driving the outcomes. So this like dismantling is, I think, quite interesting. But I think it's, I've always been interested in just using technology as the tool, but not over-teching it. I think in the end, it has to be simple. That's what a lot of companies have really gotten right. Is the simpler you make it, when that accessibility piece is going to be clear. But it can't feel like work. So don't compromise on the quality, but make it simple, make it easy for somebody to do something every day to support their mental health. So I do think that people, like the culture at large, is much more willing to engage in upstream, more preventive mental health interventions. And that's what we see with, between us and our biggest competitor, we have, 130 million people who are interested in meditating potentially. Who would have thought? So this is, that I do feel like we have permission to create resources that are more of like the fitness app than we necessarily thought about. Is we need to create those very high quality interventions. But we also need things that are a bit lighter weight. And that's actually what drew me to Headspace, was the opportunity to get in front of some mental problems.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear that some companies at least are convinced that this is important. How about the public sector? The Department of Public Health,
Yeah.
Are they in on this too?
They are. So great question, because we work with several branches of the military, and we put out a white paper on one of those, which are actually letting us share the results with one of the branches. So there's a great program, you might be familiar with this because Stephen Schiller's been involved with it, that many of the counties in California have banded together and had a call for proposals from digital mental health companies. This is the second year that they've done this, where they're actually, as a group, evaluating different evidence-based mental health technologies, and then are piloting it in counties and county mental health services. So already, Headspace has been adopted by the LA County Department of Mental Health. But we do see that this is something the public sector is quite interested in. We have a number of different kind of first responder departments, fire departments, police departments in different states, as well as in Australia, that are using Headspace, rolling this out, and actively evaluating these technologies.
They're doing the evaluations, or you're doing?
They're doing essentially a program evaluation, and then there's a research group at East Irvine that's doing a larger study. And internationally, I think this is obviously a lot of healthcare is provided by the public sector internationally. So we worked with the NHS for a long time in the UK, and they are just wrapping up a 24-site study using So I think there's great interest. They're like, and they are taking it seriously and willing to pay, and have been, I think, fairly ahead of the curve in some ways. But yeah, it's, you know, in order to work with them, you have to meet a certain standard in terms of data privacy and security. You have to have ADA compliance. And so there's an investment that, and this is why I want someone like you to be the decision maker, because I got to be the decision maker to say, I don't care what it costs, we're going to become ADA compliant. Like, that's like, if that costs $1 million, fine, but I want us to be able to be offered to the public sector. And something that's offered does have to meet certain accessibility requirements, which some companies aren't willing to invest in. But there is a demand from that sector to have digital health products developed that address the populations. So that's extremely encouraging.
Yeah. Here, Santa Clara County is, you know, I know they're doing some, but they don't seem to be very far along in that.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to check. I mean, there's 56 counties in California that are participating in this program. So, yeah.
Well, maybe there's someone from the audience.
Yeah, two questions from the Zoom audience. One question is what is the next big thing in psychology technology? And the other question is, will you ever explore immersive technology?
It's a great question. I think there are some really interesting companies that are doing immersive technology. We're going to let them do that. Far enough. We are already running 3 businesses and have an international business, so we've got a few projects on our plate for the moment. I think it's interesting. It'd be a place where I would see a company like Headspace partnering, but I don't want to be like, devices are not our business. Hardware is not something I want to build, so I'm going to let other experts do that. But I think it's a great question. I'm really interested in the research that's coming out on voice and using voice to detect mental health problems early. So I think that's something I would expect gets more attention given the technology that we have and how quickly that's evolving. And voice, you think about how we're identifying people who need help, I think that there's a lot of really interesting research that's coming out on that voice technology and its application to things that we care about.
If you were to advise students interested in getting a job in one of these 1,000 startups, how would they go about it? What would be some of the things that might make it successful for them, and what would they look for in a company that they might want to work for?
Yeah, so I would say look for somebody who is in the company already. If it's a tiny startup with 3 people, you're going to be expert. But if it's more established, I would look for someone who can mentor you, who is going to be an internal advocate for you and your skill set, because chances are some of the cross-functional team will not know how to work with you effectively. You might feel kind of left out of some processes. Then you'll need someone who's in a more senior role to say, no, she or he needs to be in that meeting. This is, this is the process of involving science in the way that we do things. So I think you need an internal champion. And frankly, it's whatever job is open, apply for it. If it's tangentially related to your experience, and that's when the learning how to pitch yourself and your skill set comes in, and get your foot in the door and then add a ton of value. And one of the great things about a lot of these companies is that there's enormous opportunity to grow and have internal mobility. So, for me, my job started as there were, a couple of aspects of my job at Headspace when I was hired. One was to figure out what to do with science, and oversee our research pipeline, and be an external face for the company. But business was not part of my job. But it was in gradually demonstrating more value and more relevance of my skill set that actually led to an expansion of my role. And so I really have that mindset of get your foot in the door, add value, and the world's your oyster. You can move levels extremely fast in these companies.
And when you said about, apply to the job that sounds right, even with whatever the title is, I suspect a lot of these startups don't know what to call the role.
They do
Right?
not.
I mean,
I've made up so many job titles. Then like, as I'm interviewing, like trying to find out from the person I'm interviewing what I really should be interviewing for. Like I know a lot of, I would not look, the person who's writing the job description might not really understand. The recruiter that you talk to might not really understand. You just need to get the interview and pitch yourself and ask them questions. Now that I have a sales team reporting to me, I can understand how to actually be good at this. They ask more questions than they talk in the first conversation, right? Like the first conversation is trying to understand then how you present yourself in a way that aligns with what their needs are. But in some of these interviews, you might be educating them. And if they feel like you're going to come in and be helpful to them, that's when they're going to hire you.
Yeah, I think we still struggle in our field, both psychology and counseling, the public doesn't always understand the breadth of our training, the skill set. I think there's a sort of narrowness that people see. It's like, oh, you sit and have therapy one-on-one with somebody, right? That's right. So I think there is that you have to be an advocate for your skill set and for what you've learned from all of the settings you've trained in, all of the different kinds of people you've worked with.
It's also a reversal of the way that you've pitched yourself for the last half of the decade, right? You're not presenting what you want to learn anymore. You're presenting what you can do. And it's a really different conversation that will feel awkward at first, but just rip off the Band-Aid and practice it. But I do think that you're used to interviewing with someone who can deeply scrutinize your skills. That's not going to be the case necessarily. And the conversation is really about what you can do for them.
Right, I mean, practicum application, internship application, postdoc application.
Yeah.
It's all about narrow, what you know how to, what you've learned, how many hours you've had doing it, all of that. It isn't articulating.
And with your training goals, right? I remember my internship interviews and talking to directors of training, if I didn't say what I wanted to learn, they weren't gonna, that wasn't the right fit because they were looking to teach people.
Right.
So this is you need to have a certain foundation, but your learning goals need to align with what they have to train you in. So that's what I've noticed in people who have interviewed for jobs I've had previously is they haven't quite realized it's time to make that switch.
Yeah, I think following up on your mentioning that people sometimes don't know what our skill set is, I find that when people are starting out in psychology, they don't know, or we don't know, what our skill set is either. It really is interesting. We're not aware of what we have learned,
right?
And that what we can provide. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
And you don't realize it until after you've been doing it for a while. And you say, oh yeah, I can do this, and I can do this, and I can do, and you didn't know you could.
Right.
It's very interesting to see that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and it might be that you want to interview actually, instead of talking to me, talk to the different functions with whom you would work in a company and realize what the overlap is with some of their skill sets, right? It might be that you're using different terminology to describe that experience, but it's the same skill at the end of the day.
When I was in this, I was talking about being university presidents, being psychologists, there were a group of 40 of us one time. We were in a training thing. 6 of us were psychologists, and we were realizing exactly what you said with her. It's we know how to, we know how to do assessment, we know how to think about, planning, we know how to do, all these skills that we sort of, had developed in our training, but now we had to talk about it in a different way.
questions? Running close to the end here. Eduardo?
What would you say that is that makes you the most proud of what you do at Headspace and Headspace?
I think the fact that we are science-backed, 100%. It's and the fact that it's such an authentic commitment. I can answer that one very succinctly.
Not a marketing pitch.
Yeah,
Steve.
you know, that's just like whether or not anyone cares that we are. That's what we're going to be. So.
I think that might be a great place to say thank you to Dr.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming.